Isolation, disconnection from peers, burnout. Many Christian leaders know how this feels. At the Living Church, we realized a long time ago that we weren't just here to be a magazine or a podcast, but a catalyst for connection. Through digital and in-person opportunities, we love creating a sanctuary for the shepherds, cultivating fellowship, continuity, and stability so that leaders can thrive, and local churches can too. So how do we do this? Through lots of pastoral emails and phone calls, actually, with friends and subscribers like you, but also in public ways, webinars, conferences, our online covenant journal, teaching and preaching resources, and the Living Church podcast. We're called to encourage those on the front lines of parish ministry. So when you donate to the Living Church, you are funding this lifeline for connection and renewal. Whether it's $5, $50, or $5,000, your gift will not only continue the products and programs that you're enjoying right now, it will encourage and equip another leader like you. Donate to the Living Church today. You can go to livingchurch.org and click donate, or check out the link that's always in the show notes.
John chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1. All things were created in Christ, for Christ. Christ holds all things. Whether they be UAPs, whether they be questions of life and death and suffering, we don't need to have the answers, but we can engage because Christ is at the heart of the universe.
The Living Church, serving the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion since 1878. Welcome to the Living Church podcast. Welcome back, podcast listeners. When I turned 30, my best friend and I drove out to Arkansas. We were looking for what they call a blue zone. If you don't know what that is, it's a place that doesn't have any light pollution, so you can see the stars. And that was our plan, to go out hiking and to see the stars. I had no idea stars were different colors. I had no idea that you could see multiple planets in the night sky. I literally said something like, "Hey, what's that long Milky patch?" before I realized I was seeing the Milky Way for the first time. This thick, sparkling superhighway of heavenly bodies running horizon to horizon. I had just never seen it. God says to Abraham, consider the stars. And the Psalms, the canticles, they constantly recommend that we look up beyond our own planet to consider the grandeur and mystery of God's handiwork. You could also say, in a way, that's what science does. Whether it's looking upward and outward or down and in, always it's going to find something of the grandeur and the mystery of what God's up to. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from a fellow stargazer and a foremost leader in the intersections of Christianity and science, specializing in resourcing ministers for engagement in and conversations about the scientific topics of our day. As we learn from him, you don't have to be an expert to point out where God might be at work in scientific expertise, even around some of the most controversial and controverted topics, like AI, climate change, and UFOs. My guest is the Reverend Dr. David Wilkinson. David is principal of St. John's College and professor in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Durham, England. His background is in theoretical astrophysics and systematic theology. I ask you. David is also a Methodist minister, has been an ecumenical canon at Durham Cathedral, and is the project director at Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. Today we talk about surprising and fruitful interactions between ministry and science, how the average parish priest can enter difficult science-related conversations, the theological implications of space travel, living on other planets, and UFO/UAP phenomena. And yes, Star Trek even gets a shout out. In our bonus segment today, we join New Testament scholar Wesley Hill for a teaser of his talk at our Radiant Pages conference, taking a quick dip into the lesser read epistles, John, Peter, even wild little Jude. And did Priscilla write the book of Hebrews? Stay tuned. You can still get your tickets for the Radiant Pages Conference at livingchurch.org/events. Use TLC Pod 10 for 10% off. Now, zip up your flight suit, or just stay home and unpack your telescope. Either way, we're taking a trip into space, or the heavens if you prefer, to visit a few things afresh about ministry to earthlings. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
I'm not the only David Wilkinson in the world. There's lots of other David Wilkinsons. In fact, I Googled myself not so long ago and found out that I was the 101st most important David Wilkinson. Even the doorman at the Dorchester Hotel in London had more hits than I did. So it's a good lesson in humility. That's good.
David, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for talking to me.
Could we start out with just a bit of your story? How in the world did you get to be a pastor, a theologian, and an astrophysicist? What a constellation of vocations this is. Would this have surprised your mother that this all came together?
It would have completely surprised my mother. I grew up in a former mining village in northwest Durham. I went to university in part to do a subject which didn't need a lot of essay writing, which would give me time to play lots of sport. And I was pretty good at mathematics, and so physics was a good subject to do. I was interested in it. I'd been a devotee of Star Trek and other science fiction. But then, just before going to university, I became a Christian. At the age of 17, suddenly for me, in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, God became real and near to me. And I found that my science and faith began to interact in ways that I didn't quite expect. As I was exploring science, I was finding out more about what God had created, what God had done. That became even more valuable. And the physics stretched my mind in terms of having too small a vision of God. When we talk about the vastness of the universe, gets you out of my Jesus, my Savior, as a kind of insular God that you carry around with you all of the time. I think the surprise for me was to move from full-time science into a call to ministry and leading a church, and then back again into the academic sphere. I've never quite planned a career or a vocation. I've gone, I hope, with what God may have been leading, and sometimes it's been very messy.
Well, a more important question, I think, do you still play cricket?
I do, but extremely badly. I'm an old man now, as you can see, and so I've moved on to golf, which I play, my wife will say, far too seriously.
Lovely. When you were talking, my mental image was of sort of a ball of dough with different ingredients going into it, and he folds you one way, and then he folds you the other way, and now we've got this blend.
Certainly, I have been likened to a ball of dough at lots of times.
Wait, I didn't mean that.
In my life, that's right. No, you're right. And there is a sense in which you are shaped by lots of things around you. You're shaped by circumstances. You're shaped by the Holy Spirit. You're shaped by the culture that we find ourselves in. You know, I'm a child of the 60s. So I grew up, age of 6, watching Neil Armstrong step onto the surface of the moon on that grainy, black and white television that I was brought out of bed to watch. I mentioned earlier I'm a child of science fiction. Those things do shape you, as well as, one hopes, the scriptures and prayer and being part of a church. So all of these things do. And the teacher's saying, you have to be sure about what subjects you take, because this is going to determine the rest of your life. And I was trying to say, no. You know, there's a way that we find our way through life, which is far more fluid, far more dynamic.
You know, David, talking about fluidity and being open to unexpected surprises having to do with vocation also reminds me of the way that I've heard physics described as such a continually surprising field. I'm curious, what has been for you one of the most surprising intersections or overlaps between Christian ministry and being an astrophysicist?
My mind goes to about 10 examples at least immediately. Let me pick out 2. The first is in my own work as a physicist. which resonates with your question. And that is that many of my theological colleagues still live with what we call the Newtonian mechanistic universe. When Isaac Newton thought about the world, he thought about his law of gravity and the motion of the planets, and he was able to predict where the planets would be in the future. The Newtonian universe was predictable and picturable. And a lot of people transferred that then onto God. The universe was a clockwork mechanism that God wound up and then went away for a cup of tea, not to have anything more to do with it. But in 20th century physics, general relativity and quantum theory, you find that the world is not picturable and predictable in the same way as Newton would have it. Actually, the world, as John Polkinghorne once said, is much more supple and subtle, much more surprising. In fact, it breaks the tyranny of common sense. Now, common sense is a pretty useful thing, but actually, theologically, common sense is a rationalization of the everyday, and every day we live with a predictable Newtonian universe. The universe actually is not like that. And God's interaction with the universe may be far more supple and subtle than that. The second example within ministry is never to underestimate the kind of questions that folk in churches have. I was a pastor for 10 years in inner city Liverpool, just round the corner from Penny Lane. We used to have a weekly luncheon club for elderly people, and I would wander around the tables, chatting with them, asking about their ailments and whether they'd been to the hospital and things of that sort. And one day I went and sat down beside a lady who was in her 80s. She'd left school at the age of 14. She'd never lived anywhere but inner city Liverpool. And she turned to me and she said, "David, this Stephen Hawking character, he's just suggested a theory of quantum gravity for the beginning of the universe. How does that relate to God the Creator?" Now, at that point, my jaw dropped because I'd made the assumption that actually she didn't think about those things. Of course, she'd watched television programs, she'd listened to radio, she'd read newspapers. And these were questions where she saw the connection between her faith as a Christian and what science was saying. And I think sometimes in my experience, Amber, has been that within ministry, we don't give enough space for people to ask questions. And some of the most profound questions. I got a question from a 7-year-old which went, if Jesus got too close to a black hole, what would happen to Jesus? Now, I have to say to you, in 40 years of theological teaching, no one has ever asked me if Jesus got too close to a black hole, what would happen to Jesus? It raises questions about Jesus' humanity, the effect of gravity and temporal distortion upon Jesus, and his divinity. How does the Lord relate to the laws of physics? It's in the asking of questions around this area of science and faith that actually we begin to think about some of the deeper issues around who God is and how he relates to the universe. And this is a very big canvas. And it's by taking specific questions, as you've said, that you begin to move beyond the generalities.
And it makes me think, too, of the task of preaching. I myself am a lay preacher. And sometimes when I'm preaching, I'm wondering, am I answering a question that no one in the pews is asking today? And I think that's always a danger. Are we as ministers answering questions that no one is actually asking today? People are always asking, where is God? Does he love me? How do I live my life? People are always asking questions like that. But we get in our own little niches of what we're interested in and how we like to interpret scripture. And I think we can have our blinders on in terms of what's really going on in other people's hearts and minds.
At the beginning of my thesis on star formation, unusually for a physics thesis, just before the foreword, I put Colossians 1:15-20, which is a passage that Paul writes where he talks about Christ as the image of the invisible God, for in him all things were created. And that very important phrase for a physicist, in him all things hold together, or all things cohere. Now, this is really important. And indeed, as we go out into space, there are real questions about human significance. So if we do discover other life forms, does that mean that human beings are not special anymore? Have we got the right to mine the moon or asteroids, where not only different nations, but different private industries want to exploit space? What are the ethics around that? I was at a meeting the other day, and it was one of these meetings where there were 40 of us, and it was a meeting about the future of space. And the person said, if you went into space, what would you take with you? One thing. And the first thing that came out for me was that I would take a Bible because I read it every day. The person next to me, Amber, said, I would take a picture of my wife. And there is a sense in which I'd slip a picture of my wife into my suit, but I think I'd still take a Bible because that, in a sense, is God's message within the whole universe, not just to the earth.
Yeah, that's lovely. Well, now that we're on the topic of outer space, and you've already brought up some issues that people are actually thinking about, they're talking about, and the US government just declassified a bunch of footage and information about UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena, the artists formerly known as UFOs.
Exactly.
And one of my goals, as I expressed to you earlier of this conversation, is to get clergy and lay leaders thinking about these kinds of things that parishioners are thinking about or experiencing or being concerned about, and even to help them to think and act theologically and wisely when it comes to some of these issues. So why don't we tackle some of these issues, David? Are you ready?
I am.
First question, why don't we start with UAPs? Why not? Extraterrestrial life, specifically rational life. I have an Episcopal priest friend who I was up and, oh my goodness, I visited him and his wife, and he and I, to my chagrin and surprise, were up until 12:30 a.m. talking about UFOs and aliens and UAPs. And he believes that pastors really underestimate the theological importance of encounters with extraterrestrial life, and that clergy should be more ready to respond wisely to concerns, or even if people report having encounters, this kind of thing. What do you think of his perspective? And if clergy should be more ready to engage this topic, how would you recommend that they do so?
I think your friend is exactly right. Now, I think for many of us in the church, we've discounted some of this area because it's fringe, or it's for people who don't think very much.
Right. It's like, should I do a Sunday school class on Bigfoot? No, right.
That's right. But I think there are different ways of looking at this. I think some people, it's part of their trying to understand our place in God's universe. Are we alone or not? If there are other life forms, does that mean that human beings are not special to God? And then there's a sense of fear that we are vulnerable human beings and are aliens coming to get us. And then there's a sense for some of a cosmic loneliness. And then there's a feeling of salvation. Will these aliens save us from the mess that we've got ourselves in? Now, these are theological themes which underlie the phenomenon. And the second thing, as well as identifying the theological themes that are going on there, is that actually the church has great riches in thinking about this over centuries. Christians were at the forefront of speculating about other worlds. From the church fathers onwards, there was a very simple argument on this. They said, if God is free to create, who are we to say that we're alone in the universe? In fact, we need to be open and to explore the evidence rather than simply close God's extravagance and creativity down. Of course, there were those Christians who wanted to locate our special uniqueness by putting us at the center of the universe. But Nicholas of Cusa, a great theologian in the 15th century, said, just hold on a moment, he said. We're special, he said, not because we're at the center of the universe or because we're alone in the universe. We're special because of relationship. God gives us a gift of relationship. That's what makes us special. And so Kuzma and others said, it doesn't matter whether we're at the center of the universe, doesn't matter whether we're alone in the universe. The thing that makes us special is the gift of relationship that we see that God has given us in Christ. And so there's great riches here of Christians who've thought about these things. I think the third thing is then just the Christian needs to have scientific curiosity, which goes beyond saying, well, I know, and I've not looked at the subject, but I know. Now, when it comes to aliens, people like R.V. Loeb and others who want science to take this issue seriously, to look at the evidence, I am fully supportive of their efforts. Because it seems to me, as a Christian, I don't want to have a closed mind. After all, I believe in a man who was raised from the dead 2,000 years ago. And for many people who aren't Christians, I will say, don't go to it with a closed mind, but look at the evidence. Now, I think the evidence is important. And for what it's worth, I'm not convinced by the evidence that we are a visited planet by aliens. I think there are lots of things that we can't explain that we need to examine further, but I'm not convinced that we have definitive evidence that we've been visited by aliens. But I want to be open to it. And I think within the pastoral situation, we adopt this kind of approach. We say, first of all, let's listen and learn. Let's explore. If someone comes to you with a pastoral problem, the first thing that you do, the most important thing is you listen and learn. And then you take time to understand what the deeper issues are. And then you bring some of the resources of the Christian tradition to bear on that particular issue. I think it's the same thing with UAPs. And then we need confidence in the resources of the Christian tradition that it's not going to simply crack and fall apart. And so I think I agree with your friend, and I wish I had been part of the conversation through to after midnight on that.
We were enjoying very delicious vodka and tonics, and it was a great time.
Yes, I can understand that. And of course, there is a correlation, a graph correlation between the time when most UAPs are seen compared to the height of alcohol consumption as well. So that's a well-known phenomenon as well.
For more than 80 years, the mission of St. Francis Ministries has been to provide healing and hope to children and families. Inspired by the past and rooted in faith, their vision is to see lives and systems transformed. But they can't do it alone. You can join them in their life-affirming ministry. St. Francis provides a wide array of services ranging from foster care and adoption to preventative and residential programs. Join their mission and help ensure children and youth receive the care they need to heal and rediscover hope. Join their mission and help families heal and regain wholeness. Join their mission and help heal the world one child at a time. They have lots of ways you can make a difference. You can explore them all at stfrancisministries.org/mission. That's St. Francis, SAINT, francisministries.org/mission. David, could you recommend one or two of these resources that you've mentioned? Would you point people to a book by John Polkinghorne? Would you point them to one of, a part of Thomas Aquinas' Summa? What is a resource that you might point a pastor to who's curious about the kind of resources that are at their fingertips?
There are a number of very good books more recently about this. Andrew Davison, an Oxford theologian, has written extensively on this. John Polkinghorne hasn't written specifically about aliens, but is a worldwide expert in science and faith. His book, One World, is a wonderful introduction to thinking about the relationship of science and faith. And Aquinas, well, it takes a bit of reading. And one of the things for Aquinas particularly was his sense that in creation, God was an extravagant creator. Now, often we make God very boring. It's all about the earth. It's all about us. It's all about me. Aquinas, in his understanding of creation, stressed time and time again that God's extravagance was something that was really important. Now, that resonates to the fact that there may be things about this universe which surprise us, that we have to actually look at in order to find out what God had done. And as a Christian who believes that God can create as God wants to, that's why I believe that we need to point our telescope and look for these things and inspect these things and critically engage with these things.
Well, speaking of taking our telescopes and pointing them at the universe and making observations, something that this has driven us to do in the past few decades that other people only literally wrote fantasy about is actually going into space as human beings, sort of breaking the atmospheric barrier, breaking out of our quarantine on this planet and going out and not only exploring the heavens to a certain extent with telescopes and satellites and things, but with our actual bodies. We can actually go to other planets. So now that this possibility is open, and now that we have sending people on vacations or maybe using Mars as a place to store some humans so we're not overburdening the planet Earth, I am curious what your thoughts are on this, David. I'm just going to out myself right now and say I'm a huge fan of the C.S. Lewis Cosmic Trilogy, in which one of the bad guys is an astrophysicist, unfortunately. I'm sorry. But I tend to agree with C.S. Lewis about humans in space. Sort of, why are we going to other planets when we've done such a nice job with this one? Space travel, what is it? Is it an opportunity? Is it a trespass? Is it a diabolical temptation? Is it the invitation of ego? Is God calling to us from it? What is your view of this, David?
For me, it's both an opportunity and a challenge. I don't think it's a trespass. And I think that comes from a Christian understanding of creation. Donald Mackay, a great professor of neuroscience at Keele University and himself a committed Christian, talked about how the Christian view is not of us poking our noses into the realms of the gods by exploring God's world. But he used the image of a parent enjoying a child exploring the garden at home. Now, there are dangerous things there. There are mistakes to be made. But there's a delight in seeing a small child explore. I think there's something about human curiosity, which is a gift from God, which is an invitation to find out about the universe. But then I think, rightly you said, is it worth the risk and is it worth the money to actually go there? Because we could send robots, we could simply sense these things through big telescopes. But there is something, I think, for Christians which is about embodiment. If God communicates with us through incarnation, there's something very important about the human body and the way that curiosity is embodied by going to places. But I think there's caution and challenges as well. Sending human beings into space is risky and it's expensive because space is not a welcoming environment. Secondly, there's something absolutely that Lewis and others have highlighted, which is contamination of the worst sort, not just of taking bugs from the earth to other places, but also the contamination of using other worlds for our own benefit, our selfishness. We've seen that in the colonial program from the West in times past, where we've ignored the beauty and culture in order for our own financial gain. And that sense of contamination or use of other places, I think, is a real challenge and something that we need to think seriously about. And as Christians, we'll want to say something about even as Buzz Aldrin said, the magnificent desolation of the surface of the moon is part of God's creation. We want to respect it and value it, just as we might do Antarctica or the Arctic. There's also a real sense of challenge about motive. So as you rightly said, some of the thinking about going out into space is to put human beings onto other planets so that the Earth is not as vulnerable to future catastrophes. And my main fear is that any exploration of space which goes to new worlds will be the rich people going, leaving the poor behind. Because we see that in cities, don't we? We see migration of people within cities who have the power and the money, leaving those who don't in the mess that the rich people have caused in the first place. So there's a question of justice in all of this, which seems to me to be very important. I think, therefore, Christians who are prepared to get involved in the space industry, Christians who are prepared to go into space, Christians who are prepared to work in the midst of difficult governmental or private enterprise companies, seems to me to be very important. It's what Jesus talked about, being salt and light. Actually, this whole area is one in embryo at the moment, and we can influence it. We can shape it for good. Now, it involves difficult questions, and the cost is high for people who work in these industries. But I meet an awful lot of very good scientists and technologists who are at the forefront of these industries and are not crazed megalomaniacs. They're good people wanting to do good things. Just a few weeks ago, I was at Caltech and at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, just outside Pasadena. And I have to say, I met a number of Christian folk and a number of folk who weren't Christians, but were committed to these issues of justice alongside curiosity and exploration.
I'm glad you put it this way, David, because coming to this question as a space travel skeptic, I'm also sort of a hypocrite because I am a big sci-fi fan. Science fiction is one of the genres, books and films that have inspired me the most to think about theological questions, to think about theological anthropology, that have just moved my heart, made me cry, made me wonder, and also back to the space trilogy, even though that skepticism about space travel is there and the concern about contamination, it's also the case that the central character of all three books is someone who does go to other planets for the purpose of bearing the presence of Christ in a broken and limited and sinful way as a sinful man. But he's bearing the presence of Christ to these planets, also contributing something to the life of where he's going, even though he's also having adventures with diabolical figures, et cetera, as well.
I'm a great science fiction fan as well. And the great thing about science fiction is that it enables you to think about worlds which are very different to our own, which then take you back to our own world. And so Star Trek in the 1960s was this wonderful storytelling which allowed issues within American culture and society to be put onto the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, to be explored at depth in a way that actually politically they were too sensitive to be explored in a news program or whatever. Now, I think there's something also about space travel physically, not just in science fiction, that allows us to see ourselves from afar. So that part of a very moving dimension of the Artemis mission was when the astronauts reflected back on their view of the Earth. It was wonderfully poetic at times. And as we know, the 1968 Earthrise photograph taken by Apollo 8, the first time that we saw the Earth from the moon, that became iconic and energy-giving to the new movement of climate sensitivity And I don't think it's just a matter of a spaceship taking that photograph. The very fact that a fellow human being was looking back and taking that photograph and talking about it becomes extremely important for human community to see itself in a different way. And I think there are issues and there are problems. Don't get me wrong. These are challenging issues for us and become even more challenging. But they are, I think, part of the way that we learn about ourselves.
That's right. And Thomas Aquinas would definitely agree with you, being bodily creatures who have to experience things through our bodies. It also reminds me the first epistle of John, where he says, the things that we've seen with our eyes and we've touched with our hands, and these are the basis of basically, the way that the community of God's people was a living doxology to God. And it's based in what they're experiencing. If humans are in space, the experience of other planets and the start, anything we're experiencing outside the planet Earth, maybe at best is just being added to the doxology of praise that humans are able to offer. What do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely right and very profound. And that sense that, you see, the great heresy of Western Christianity was the way that we took Greek dualism on board. The body and the physical is evil. It's only the spirit that's good. No, says Scripture. It's about feeling the bread, drinking the wine. It's about being in the same location with people beside you. But you took the conversation on another stage in a really interesting way, which is to talk about the doxology, not just of human beings in different places, but of the whole of creation. And we know that as we read the Psalms, for example, particularly, this sense of what it means for the whole creation to give praise to God. And for us to see our lives in a context of worship, we resonate with the whole praise of God from creation. If human beings are perhaps the priests of creation, as some have said, there is a prophetic role in praise of the whole of creation, which talks about the awesomeness of God, the diversity of God, the extravagance of God, the sense of this God can be praised without limit. These are some of the things that, for me as an astrophysicist, have become very important in worship, the sense of how the whole creation worships God. We've focused too much on just what we do as human beings, whereas in a sense, what does it mean for the whole creation to sing God's praise?
I would guess most people listening to this podcast live in an area that has some light pollution, probably quite a bit of light pollution. And I'm thinking of the way in days past, like when Psalm 8 was written. When I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you've said in their courses, what is man that you're mindful of him? They're in a world with no light pollution when they're seeing that. So they're seeing this incredible just jewel basket of stars that are different colors, and this thick Milky Way coming across the sky like the handle of a basket. And they're seeing, shooting stars and things like this. So I'm curious if there's a resource you might recommend to people who might want to just refresh their imagination and their sense of wonder about what might be hiding behind that light pollution. Is there a website that has like live footage or certain, a place like with the best Hubble telescope images or something? What would you recommend people go to?
The wonderful gift, in fact, that your country has given us is NASA. NASA is a wonderful gift to the whole of the world. And I myself will go onto the NASA website regularly because, first of all, it gives you updated pictures from space telescopes such as Hubble and Webb. It gives you some images or artist impressions of new exoplanets, planets around other stars, which we're now into thousands of. We never expected that. And just spending some time looking at the pictures, reading the descriptions. NASA does a terrific job. They're also copyright free, which is terrific. And one of my favorite images of a scientist is back to sport, I'm afraid. One of the things of watching a football match on the television is not just you watch what's going on, but you also have commentators and experts who point out things that you don't see immediately. And they'll say, look at that, what happened, that forward took the ball with that foot and then someone else ran a particular line. Did you see that? Well, I wouldn't have seen that live. I need the commentator to help me to understand just how significant and how awe-inspiring that goal was. Now, the scientist has a responsibility, I think, as the commentator on God's creation, that they point out, for those of us who don't understand immediately, just how amazing that picture is that we're looking at. And NASA is a wonderful example of this, help you to understand what's going on.
And scientists as commentators is a wonderful image too. The US, we're in a political environment right now. We have an administration who has expressed hostility to quote unquote the experts, And so it can be hard, I think, for pastors, if they're wanting to engage what people are really thinking about and feeling and engage it theologically, to even open some of those conversations, or to feel like if someone brings it up and they have a very passionate opinion, as a pastor, in short, you could feel tongue-tied, not only because you're not an expert, but because it can be such a tense topic. Things are not taken for granted, like climate change is a tense topic. People, do not agree that it's real. And, like UFOs now is an increasing topic people are talking about, and other things involving space travel and technology and AI. And so all that said, do you have any tips, David, for pastors as they engage with people who come to them with spicy science-related topics? Do you have any tips for them for engaging courageously, pastorally, and truthfully?
Wonderful question. And I think there are one or two things that we've learned in our work here over the years. Here in Durham, where we have a project called Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. One or two quick tips from my own mistakes over the years, Amber. The first is that as a pastor, I don't need to be the expert on everything. I don't need to give an answer to everything. That actually a simple phrase such as "I don't know" actually is all right. Sometimes we feel that we need to be the source of all wisdom. And in fact, we're not as pastors or priests. I think the second thing is that God has given us a wonderful resource in this, and that is the scientists within our own congregations, the person who teaches biology in the local high school, the engineer who works on AI, the young person is passionate about coding and gaming, the professional vocation of scientists within a congregation sometimes is not affirmed by the church. Many scientists within local congregations have talked to me and said, well, I keep my head down because I'm not too sure, not just what other members of the congregation, but what the pastor thinks of me. Whereas I think that to be a chemist or an engineer is a Christian vocation as much as it is to be a pastor or a missionary. If we're having one of those spicy conversations, a good pastor will be able to say, well, have you met Joan over here, who happens to be a climate scientist? Why don't we have a conversation? And we're thinking about doing outreach. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have an evening where we explore science and Christianity? And as pastor, I don't need to be the one answering all of the questions. But Bob here has worked for 20 years in AI, even before AI was trendy. Why not? Now, sometimes the scientists need a bit of confidence from the pastor to affirm their vocation and to say, don't worry, I'm not going to put you in front of 100 people and leave you by yourself.
This isn't the Inquisition either.
That's right. Let's do something like Amber's doing here, which is thinking about an interview and questions. And then why not bring together some of the scientists and technologists together as a group? So we don't have to be experts. I think the third thing is theological confidence. I do something here in the UK, Amber, which is called Thought for the Day, where I appear on one of our main radio news programs on the BBC, and I get 2 minutes, 45 seconds to connect something in the news that morning to Jesus. I can't tell you how nervous I get trying to do it on a contemporary issue and connect it to Jesus and all of the risks that are involved. And I remember asking someone a long time previously, who did it for a number of years. I said, where do you get your confidence from to go in front of 6-7 million people and talk about a contemporary news story in Jesus? And he simply said, John chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1. Those passages that say that all things were created in Christ, for Christ, and that Christ holds all things. His point was that there is no philosophy, no person, no place which is beyond Jesus. There's always a connection there. Often takes me a very long time to find it, Amber, but the connection is there. And that gives me that confidence which says that we can engage with these questions, whether they be UAPs, whether they be questions of life and death and suffering. We don't need to have the answers, but we can engage because Christ is at the heart of the universe. And if we do so in ways that offer this to people rather than say to people, you need to believe this, then I think people are open to us bringing the theological resources of the Christian faith to the table in some of these areas.
In an interview with Salt and Light last December, you said, God is not just a divine mathematician, God is the great artist. I'm curious what work of art you think really could help grow the Christian imaginary in a good direction when it comes to science and faith.
What a wonderful question. There's a lithograph by Salvador Dali that we had in our college here in Durham. And it was, you've probably seen a picture by Dali of Christ on the cross above the world.
Yes.
Well, this was an earlier version than this. And Dali had put behind the cross on his lithograph the traces of particles through a cloud chamber. Cloud chamber was used by early particle physicists to trace a path of particles. And you would see them collide and they would be able to see different particles come off. And Dali had put the cross against this background of physics. I mean, I love just sitting there having my lunch in front of that particular piece of art. I think also I love certain contemporary Christian songs. I mean, there's an old song called How Great Is Your God? Sing with me, How Great Is God? So from Dali through to contemporary Christian songs, those are some of the things that have helped me enormously.
Great. And maybe throw some old episodes of Star Trek in there as well, if people...
Absolutely. Of course, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, didn't want God to be in Star Trek. He thought that the future would be godless and that science and technology would not need God. What's happened if you're a great Star Trek nerd like I am, is that as Star Trek developed into Next Generation and then into Voyager and Deep Space Nine, you began to find God popping up in lots of different ways. So even Gene Roddenberry couldn't stop God getting in there somewhere.
I've been speaking today with the Reverend Dr. David Wilkinson, principal of St. John's College and professor in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Durham, England, and project director at Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. And I'll include a link to that wonderful organization in the show notes. David, thanks again for coming on the show.
Amber, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for all you do in this area. This is really important.
teacher, are you looking for new resources to make preaching each week a little easier and, dare I say it, maybe even fun? Well, you can join Episcopal priests Father Jacob Smith and Father Aaron Zimmerman for the Same Old Song podcast. Same Old Song. Each week, they break down the lectionary texts for the coming Sunday with gospel insight, a few appropriate cultural references, sometimes slightly inappropriate, and a heart for the sufferer in the pew and the pulpit, all in half an hour. Check out Same Old Song wherever you get your podcasts, or check out the link in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in to our main segment of the podcast. For our bonus chat, I called up the Reverend Dr. Wesley Hill for a taste of some of his latest research on the New Testament epistles not written by Paul, the other epistles. We particularly discuss John, but dip into Peter, Jude, and Hebrews. I enjoyed not only some fascinating new facts, but also fun speculation about gospel epistle connections, authorship, and the Antichrist. Watch out, Tim LaHaye. The Reverend Dr. Wesley Hill is an author, speaker, and professor, and currently serves as Associate Professor of New Testament at Wycliffe College, Toronto. He has several new books in the works, including a theological commentary on the Johannine epistles. We hope you enjoy the chat. Wes, you are a guest speaker at our Bible conference in September, Radiant Pages. And of course, you will be speaking on the New Testament, but you'll be talking about a subject I don't think that I've ever heard really in depth, which is the non-Pauline epistles, especially James and John, right? That's what you'll be tackling for us.
Focusing mostly on John, but yes, exactly. The neglected part of the New Testament.
Today's conversation is going to be a little appetizer of your talk. Last time I went out to eat and ordered an appetizer, they asked me what spice level would I like. So my question for this appetizer comes in two different spice levels, Wes. So here's the mild spice level is, what is distinctive, would you say, about quote unquote, the rest of the epistles, definitely not written by Paul? You want to hear the spicy version?
I would love to.
What would we be missing as Christians if we only had the epistles of Paul? So
I like both versions.
You like both versions? Okay. Well, we can only bring you one appetizer. But anywho, maybe you can blend the spice levels. How would you answer that?
I think when we look at the book of Acts, we very much see Paul as, what I told my students is, he's kind of the protagonist of the book of Acts. He certainly dominates the second half of the book of Acts, but he's not alone. He travels with Barnabas and others. He meets in Jerusalem with the so-called pillar apostles, as he refers to them in Galatians. Peter is a prominent character at the beginning of Acts. James is the sort of acknowledged leader of the Jerusalem church. And the letters that we have in the latter part of the New Testament are attributed to these figures, Peter, James, John. And of course, when we read the Synoptic Gospels, those are the three closest companions of Jesus, Peter, James, and John. They're with him on the Mount of Transfiguration. They are with him in the Garden of Gethsemane. He has a kind of special closeness to them. And so when we're reading this portion of the New Testament, we're invited to read these texts as parallel witnesses to Jesus in his messiahship, in his glory, alongside the witness of Paul. And we're invited to read them in a way that harmonizes rather than kind of revels in their distinctiveness, even to the point of seeing conflict between them. So, for example, we get to the end of 2 Peter. He says, "Count the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul once wrote to you according to the wisdom given him, as he does in all his letters. There are some things in them," that is the letters of Paul, "that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures." There's this writer explicitly naming, I want you to see me as in continuity with Paul, but I also want to say Paul can be misread, and I'm here to kind of balance things out.
Okay, Wes, what do we do with the book of Jude? We haven't even talked about Jude. Who is he?
Question.
What do we do? What do we do with the book of Jude?
So I think one of the things we do with Jude is, he talks about the faith that's been delivered to the saints. And so what we see is there's this movement in the latter portion of the New Testament toward what we might call today more creedal Christianity. There's an awareness that there are false prophets out there peddling a different gospel or different gospels, plural. The first letter of John warns against antichrists, plural. I grew up thinking there was going to be one.
There was just
antichrist,
one. Little
like
did you
Nikolai
know.
Carpathia, and that's not the picture. There's
I'm sorry. I read the Left Behind series too, so no shame.
Yes. I think what you see is there's not one singular opponent of the gospel. There are many different counterfeits out there. And so these epistles, including Jude, including the Johannine letters, I think are written with that understanding that we need to have some kind of definition of our faith. There needs to be a kind of creedal statement of what it is that we believe. I think Jude moves in that direction. I actually think all these epistles move in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, Jude super moves in that direction. Jude is like, these people who are just spreading all this disinformation about the gospel, they are wandering stars for whom it is reserved the eternal darkness. It's like, oh, wow. Okay, let's wrestle. Let's unpack that. Let's wrestle with that. Okay, well, Wes, if our dear sister, Amy Peeler, were here, she would have a little something to say about Hebrews. I don't know if this is a hot take question or not. I honestly have no clue. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? Okay. Was it a woman? Could it have been Priscilla? Please say yes.
Well, Adolf von Harnack, who's one of the greatest scholars of early Christianity, he argued that it was Priscilla who wrote it, which I've always been attracted to. I've always found myself wanting that to be true. Obviously, I don't think any of us knows. It's unattributed. The author doesn't name herself or himself. There are folks who speculate that it could have been Apollos, but of course, Apollos was tutored by Priscilla. So maybe she's lurking there in the background somewhere.
Going back to our little food flavor metaphor, do you know this flavor profile called umami?
Yeah.
Umami is like just savory, super savory. What is something for you about the Johannine epistles that is umami, that's just super savory? No matter how many times you go back to it, it still has that rich flavor profile for you.
As I was starting work on my commentary, I emailed Richard Bauckham, who a lot of listeners may know his name. He wrote a very important book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and he's done a lot of really wonderful work on the Gospel of John. And I wrote to him and said, I know you haven't written on the epistles of John, but you've written a lot on the gospel. Do you have any pointers for me? Is there anything you'd say, be sure to explore this as I work on this commentary? And he wrote back and he said, I think anybody who reads these epistles has to ask the question about how John doesn't simply talk about God's love as an action on our behalf. John takes it a step further and says that God is love. Not just that he acts lovingly or does loving things, but that he is in his nature love, in his essence. And Bauckham said, I would love to see you explore that. And I think that's exactly the right question to ask. What is it that makes John say what we see in the life of Jesus, what we see in his self-giving death and his resurrection is not just a kind of accidental episode? That is a true disclosure into who God is fundamentally. God is love.
That also really helps, I think, when we get to this sense that there's some kind of divide between the Old and the New Testament, or that God somehow kind of changes tack with Jesus, but that seems to lend much more of a consistency in God's actions toward humans throughout time.
That's right. That's right.
If people come to the conference and they hear your talk, what do you most hope as you're writing your talks that people who come wanting to learn how to read the Bible better, or with more skill, or with more confidence, or with more affection, what do you hope that they'll take away from your talk?
I'm so struck in 1 John by the interplay between divine love and our calling to love each other. I want people to walk away with a sense of, yes, God is love in God's nature, and that's a glorious truth, but the way that it touches down or takes place in human life is the kind of acid test as to whether I've properly understood God and know God. And so I want us to think about what it means to live with integrity, to have faith with integrity, where what we say with our mouths is congruent with the way we spend our money and the way we are on the lookout for those who might need care and comfort in all kinds of ways. I want to look at that nexus or that interplay between divine love and human love.
Wes, I'm looking forward to learning more about that with everybody who's going to be at the conference in September. Wes, thanks for the bonus chat.
Thanks. It's always a pleasure, Amber.
Thanks for tuning in to the Living Church Podcast, a ministry of the Living Church. This episode was edited and mixed by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. Learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. In 2 weeks, how does a parish or diocese recover from natural disaster? Are there ways to prepare? We'll hear the stories of 3 Episcopal priests who have been through fire and flood. Until then, I'm Amber Noel, your host, and it's been good to be with you. Peace.